the night of November 4th. 1274 was darker than most on the island of Tsushima. A fisherman named Teo stood on the western cliffs. His weathered hands gripped the rough stone as he stared at something that made his blood run cold. The horizon, normally an endless expanse of black water meeting blacker sky, now flickered with thousands of points of light. Torches. So many torches that they seemed to set the very ocean ablaze. He counted 10 ships, then 20, then gave up counting as the fleet continued to emerge in the darkness like demons crawling from the underworld. 900 war vessels carrying the wrath of the largest empire the world had ever seen were approaching his tiny island. Teo knew with certainty that by tomorrow's sunset, everyone he loved would likely be dead. But here's the thing about that night that most people don't know. This detail makes the story transcend from mere military history into something almost mythological. The invaders weren't just any army. This was the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself. It was the same dynasty that had conquered everything from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, from the frozen steppes of Russia. They had crushed the Chinese dynasties, brought Korea to its knees, and left a trail of destroyed civilizations. Entire peoples had simply ceased to exist after the Mongols passed through. Now, with 8,000 battle-hardened warriors aboard those ships, they were coming for Japan, standing in their way. 80 samurai, not 8,000. Not 800, 80. Let me say that again because the number is so absurd it bears repeating. 80 samurai were all that stood between the greatest military machine in human history and the conquest of Japan. The math was simple and brutal. 100 Mongol warriors for every single defender. If you're thinking that sounds less like a battle and more like a massacre, you'd be absolutely right. That's exactly what everyone expected it to be. But what actually happened over the next 48 hours would change the course of Asian history and give birth to a legend so powerful that it would echo through the centuries, inspiring warriors even 700 years later in the final, desperate days of World War II. Now, before we dive into the bloodshed, and trust me, there will be plenty of bloodshed, we need to understand who these players were and what was really at stake here. This wasn't just a military conflict. This was a clash of civilizations, of philosophies, of entirely different ways of understanding what warfare even meant. And to appreciate the sheer audacity of what the samurai attempted, you need to understand just how terrifying the Mongol Empire was in 1274. Kublai Khan wasn't some distant warlord sending troops on a whim. He was the fifth great Khan of the Mongol Empire, a man who had already conquered the Song dynasty in southern China, completing what his grandfather Genghis had started. He controlled the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Vietnam. His armies had defeated every major military power they'd encountered. The famous Muslim caliphates crushed, the Russian principalities subjugated, the Chinese Empire, which had stood for thousands of years, now ruled by the Mongols. Kublai's resume was basically a list of impossible victories, and Japan was next on his checklist. The Mongol military system was revolutionary for its time. They'd invented combined arms warfare, coordinating cavalry, infantry, and siege weapons in ways that European armies wouldn't figure out for another 300 years. They used psychological warfare, spreading terror through stories of their brutality, so that cities would surrender without a fight. And they were absolutely ruthless about using any advantage, no matter how dishonorable it might seem to their enemies. Their weapons technology was cutting edge. They had compound bows that could fire arrows further and with more force than anything the Japanese had seen. They used poison arrows, not because they were cruel, though they certainly could be, but because poison multiplied the effectiveness of each shot. And then there were the bombs. The Thunder Crash bombs that the Mongols carried were ceramic or metal spheres filled with gunpowder and metal fragments. When thrown, they would explode on impact, creating a flash of light bright enough to temporarily blind, a sound loud enough to rupture drums and panic horses, and shrapnel that could kill or maim anyone within several meters. For medieval warriors who had never encountered gunpowder, these weapons seemed like sorcery. The Mongol invasion fleet that assembled in Korean ports in the summer of 1274 was massive by medieval standards. 900 ships is a staggering number when you consider that each one had to be built by hand. provisioned with food and water for potentially months at sea, and crewed by sailors who knew what they were doing. The invasion force itself was a multi-ethnic army that reflected the diversity of the Mongol Empire. The core shock troops were ethnic Mongols, the horse archers who had conquered most of Asia. Supporting them were Chinese infantry, recent conscripts who had military training but questionable loyalty to their new overlords. Korean sailors operated most of the ships, and they brought their own soldiers as well. In total, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 fighting men were crammed onto those 900 ships. Their objective was straightforward: conquer Japan in a lightning campaign before winter made further operations impossible. The plan called for taking Tsushima Island in a matter of hours. It was small and lightly defended. Then they'd hit Iki Island, slightly larger but still manageable. With those stepping stones secured, the fleet would make the final crossing to Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, where they'd establish a beachhead and begin the systematic conquest of the archipelago. It was a good plan, a solid plan, the kind of plan that had worked dozens of times before against other enemies. There was just one problem. They were about to run into samurai, who had fundamentally different ideas about how warfare should work. Now, let's talk about the defenders. So, Sukakuni was 67 years old in 1274, which made him ancient by medieval standards. Most people didn't live past 40 back then. At 67, he should have been sitting by a fire, somewhere telling stories to grandchildren, not preparing to fight the largest invasion force in Asian history. But Sukakuni was a deputy governor of Tsushima, the Jayadai, which meant he was responsible for the island's defense. And when word reached him that the Mongol fleet had been spotted approaching, he didn't panic, didn't flee, didn't send desperate messages begging for reinforcement that he knew wouldn't arrive in time. He simply accepted his duty and began preparing to die as well as possible. Sukakuni's samurai weren't the elite warriors of legend. They weren't the highly trained professional soldiers who served the great daimyo of mainland Japan. Most of them were essentially armed landowners, local gentry who owned enough property to afford a horse, armor, and weapons, and who were obligated to provide military service in exchange for their holdings. They trained regularly, sure, but their training was mostly formal exercises against imaginary opponents. Very few had seen actual combat. Tsushima was a backwater, a small island whose main industries were fishing and farming, but what they lacked in experience, they made up for in cultural conditioning. Samurai culture in the late 13th century was intensely focused on honor, loyalty, and the acceptance of death. The concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, wasn't yet the formalized code it would become in later centuries, but the essential elements were already in place. A samurai was expected to be loyal to his lord unto death. The retreat was shameful. Surrender was unthinkable. The only honorable outcomes in battle were victory or death, preferably a glorious death that would be remembered in stories and songs. This mentality seems insane to modern sensibilities. Why would you fight when you know you'll lose? Why not retreat, regroup, and live to fight another day when conditions are more favorable? But that kind of pragmatic thinking was antithetical to samurai culture. Honor wasn't just important. It was more important than life itself. A samurai who died fighting was honored. A samurai who fled lived in shame. And in a culture where shame could destroy your entire family's reputation for generations, death was genuinely preferable. The day before the invasion, something happened that would become legendary in Japanese folklore. The shrine to Hachim, the god of war and divine protector of Japan, caught fire. This shrine was located far from any village, deep in the forest where no one lived and few people ever visited. There was no obvious source of the fire. It just spontaneously combusted in the middle of the day. In Japanese religious tradition, this was an extremely bad omen. Shrines don't burn without reason, and when they do, it means the deity is angry or has abandoned the place. But Sukakuni, displaying either brilliant leadership or magnificent delusion, depending on your perspective, reframed the event entirely. He declared that Hachimon hadn't abandoned them. The god of war had set his own shrine ablaze as a warning, an alarm bell to wake the defenders to the approaching danger. And as proof, white doves, the sacred messengers of Hachimon, had appeared and landed on the shrine's roof just as the flames were being extinguished. The doves were a sign. Sukune proclaimed that Hachiman was watching and would fight alongside them in the coming battle. Whether Sukune actually believed this or whether he was just trying to prevent mass panic is unclear from the historical records. What matters is that it worked. Instead of demoralization, the burning shrine became a rallying point. Sukune immediately declared martial law across the island. He ordered the evacuation of all non-combatants into the mountainous interior. Every able-bodied man was to report to designated assembly points with whatever weapons they could carry. The 80 mounted samurai would form the core of the defense at Komoda Beach, the most likely landing site. As the sun set on November 4th, Sukune's forces were as ready as they could be. The samurai had donned their armor, lacquered plates laced together with silk cords designed to deflect slashing attacks while remaining flexible enough to allow movement. They carried their primary weapons, the yumi, a long bow made of laminated bamboo and wood that could fire arrows with tremendous force, and the tachi, a curved sword worn edge down from the belt, the predecessor to the famous katana. They also knew this would be their last sunset. Samurai tradition called for the composition of death poems, GI short verses that expressed the warrior's final thoughts. One young samurai wrote, "Autumn storm brings enemies across the sea, but like the ancient pine, I bend and do not break. My roots run deep in the sacred soil." Another more pragmatic simply wrote, "Tomorrow the crows feast. Tonight I sharpen my blade." Both serve their purpose. These weren't flowery romantic gestures. These were men confronting their mortality and trying to find meaning in what they were about to do. If you're still with me at this point, I want to ask you to do something. Hit that like button right now. This video represents months of research, combing through Japanese, Chinese, and Korean historical sources. I'm trying to tell you the real story, not the Hollywood version, and that takes work. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel because we're going to keep digging into these forgotten corners of history where the most incredible stories are hiding. The Mongol fleet dropped anchor at 2 o'clock in the morning on November 5th, about a mile offshore from Komoda Beach. The samurai had been waiting in position since sunset, and the long night vigil had been psychologically exhausting. Now, as the first hints of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, they could see the true scope of what they faced. 900 ships. The number is hard to even conceptualize. The ships covered the bay so completely that you literally couldn't see the water between them. It was as if a wooden city had sprouted overnight just off the coast. Sukune made one last attempt at diplomacy. He selected 4 samurai and sent them in a small boat to approach the fleet and request negotiations. Perhaps there was a chance to avoid bloodshed. The negotiation boat got within 100 meters of the nearest Mongol warship before the first arrows flew. Dozens of them shot, not in a carefully aimed volley, but as a clear message. There would be no talking. The 4 samurai turned their boat around and raced back to shore. When they reported what had happened, Sukune simply nodded. He'd expected this. Now there was no ambiguity. The Mongols had come for conquest, and the only response left was resistance. At 4 in the morning, as the sun began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, the first wave of landing craft pushed off from the main fleet. These were smaller boats, each carrying perhaps 20 to 30 soldiers, and there were dozens of them in the first wave alone. The Mongol invasion strategy was sophisticated. Send the Chinese infantry first as shock troops and arrow magnets. They'd absorb the initial defensive fire while establishing a beachhead. Once they'd secured a foothold, the Mongol cavalry would land, and that's when the real slaughter would begin. The first troops to hit the beach weren't warriors eager for glory. They were conscripted Chinese peasants who'd been given minimal training, basic armor, and large wicker shields. Their job was simple. Don't die too quickly. Rush forward, form a shield wall, and protect the real soldiers who'd be coming behind them. It was a brutal calculus, using human beings as disposable resources, but it was also militarily effective. The samurai, positioned in the tree and about 50 m back from the beach, watched the landing craft approach. Sukune had given explicit orders. Do not fire until the enemy is committed to the beach. Let them think the landing is unopposed. Wait until they're disembarking, when they're most vulnerable. Then unleash everything. The first boat crunched onto the sandy beach. Soldiers jumped out, wading through knee-deep water. struggling to maintain formation in the surf. A second boat landed, then a third, then 10 more. Chinese infantry poured onto the beach, shields raised, expecting arrows at any moment. But the beach remained silent, except for crash of waves and the shouts of officers organizing their men. Then Tsushima gave the signal. 80 samurai archers rose from concealment and fired in unison, but they didn't fire normal arrows. Following ancient tradition, the first shots were kabaraya, whistling arrows with specialist heads that created a high-pitched shriek as they flew through the air. These arrows weren't meant to kill. They were ceremonial, a way of announcing to heaven and earth that battle was joined. The Mongols heard the whistling arrows pass overhead and apparently thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever encountered. According to Japanese accounts, the Mongol and Chinese soldiers actually laughed out loud. In their military tradition, whistling arrows were communication tools. The idea that you'd waste arrows on making noise before a battle struck them as ridiculous. Their laughter stopped when the second volley came. This time, the arrows were designed to kill. 80 samurai firing in coordinated waves could put hundreds of arrows into the air in seconds. The yumi, the Japanese longbow, was a fearsome weapon. Arrows slammed into the Chinese infantry with devastating effect. Men fell, some killed instantly by arrows to the throat or eye, others wounded and screaming. The shields provided some protection, but wicker only stopped so many arrows. That's when the Mongols deployed their first technological surprise. From the larger warships offshore came a new sound, a series of loud bangs followed by objects arcing through the air toward the Japanese positions. These were the thunder crash bombs. When the first bomb landed near a group of samurai, it exploded with a flash of light and a concussive boom that could be heard across the entire island. The effect was immediate and devastating. The bomb didn't kill anyone directly, but the horses absolutely lost their minds. Japanese horses had been bred for temperament and obedience, trained to ignore the sounds of battle, but they'd never heard an explosion before. To them, it sounded like the world was ending. Horses bucked through their riders, bolted in every direction. Samurai who'd spent years learning to fight from horseback were suddenly on the ground, disoriented and vulnerable. The Mongols, recognizing the opportunity, poured more troops onto the beach. Now Mongol cavalry began landing, and these were the real warriors, men who'd grown up in the saddle, who could hit a moving target at full gallop, who'd fought in dozens of campaigns across Asia. But here's where things get interesting, because the samurai, for all their disadvantages, had one crucial edge. They could adapt. Tsushima saw immediately that traditional tactics were failing. The beach was a killing ground where Mongol numerical superiority and superior weapons would prevail. He couldn't win that fight, so he changed the fight. Tsushima ordered a tactical retreat into the forest. Not a rout, not a panic flight, but an organized withdrawal. The samurai fell back from the beach in small groups, covering each other's retreat with arrows, using the terrain to break the line of sight with the enemy. The Mongols, seeing their opponents flee, assumed they'd won. They poured more troops ashore, thousands of men now, forming up on the beach to pursue the retreating Japanese into the interior. And that's exactly what Tsushima wanted them to do. The Mongols were brilliant at open field warfare, using coordinated cavalry charges and mass archery to overwhelm opponents. But in dense forest, on steep hillsides cut through with ravines and streams, with terrain they didn't know, against an enemy who knew every tree and rock, their advantages evaporated. The fighting that occurred in the forest of Tsushima over the next several hours was brutal and utterly one-sided in a way that favored the Japanese. Small groups of samurai would ambush Mongol units that had gotten separated from their main force, kill or wound as many as possible, then vanish into the undergrowth before reinforcements could arrive. The Mongols tried to maintain their formation, moving in large, coordinated groups, but the terrain simply didn't allow it. Paths too narrow for more than 2 men abreast. Slopes too steep for horses. Visibility is reduced to a few meters in any direction. One engagement that became legendary occurred at a narrow valley near Mount Matak. 20 samurai led by a warrior whose name has been lost to history prepared an ambush for a Mongol force of about 300 men who were attempting to pursue fleeing Japanese forces through the valley. The samurai had prepared the ground beforehand, digging pits along the valley floor and covering them with branches and leaves. They positioned large logs on the slopes above the valley, held in place by wooden wedges that could be kicked free. When the Mongol unit entered the valley, the samurai sprung their trap. The logs came rolling down the slopes, massive pieces of timber that crushed anyone in their path and caused mass panic. Men fell into the hidden pits and found themselves trapped. And when the Mongols tried to retreat back the way they came, they found samurai blocking that exit as well. The fighting in that valley lasted about an hour. When it was over, somewhere between 60 and 90 Mongol soldiers were dead or dying, and the rest had scattered into the forest. The 20 samurai who'd planned the ambush, 3 dead, 5 wounded, but the rest were alive and ready to fight again. Now, I need to pause here and talk about something that bothers me about how this story usually gets told. There's a tendency to portray the samurai as these mystical warrior monks who are just inherently superior fighters. That's nonsense. The samurai weren't better warriors than the Mongols on an individual level. If anything, the average Mongol soldier probably had more combat experience. What the samurai had was home field advantage and an absolute refusal to quit, even when quitting was the objectively smart move. One samurai in particular became legendary during this phase, a man named Tsukasada, about whom history records frustratingly little. Personally cut down 25 enemy soldiers in individual combat, according to the Sori Kafu. Now, I'm always skeptical of historical kill counts because they tend to get exaggerated. But even if the real number was half that, we're still talking about one man holding off a significant portion of an enemy force. Tsukasada fought with Naginata, a pole weapon with a curved blade at the end, which gave him reach advantage in the close confines of the forest. But let's also be absolutely clear, the samurai were losing. By midday, the Mongols controlled the beaches and had pushed several miles inland. They'd lost maybe 1,000 men, which sounds like a lot until you realize they had 30,000 more where those came from. The Japanese, meanwhile, had lost about half their force. 40 of the original 80 mounted samurai were dead or too badly wounded to continue fighting. The survivors were exhausted, running low on arrows, and knew that they were simply delaying the inevitable. Sukune gathered his remaining men, probably around 40 fighters, still able to hold a weapon and held a council. They could continue the guerrilla tactics, harassing the Mongols for another day or two before being hunted down and killed. Or they could make one final grand gesture, a night attack directly into the main Mongol encampment. It would be suicide, absolutely guaranteed death, but it would also be the kind of attack that stories are made of, the kind of courage that would be remembered and retold for generations. His men voted unanimously for the night attack, because these weren't modern soldiers making tactical calculations about the best way to win. These were samurai whose entire cultural identity was wrapped up in dying gloriously. They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing. They sharpened their swords one last time. They repaired damaged armor as best they could, and many added final lines to their death poems, completing the verses they'd started the day before. As the sun set on November 5th, the island of Tsushima was transformed. Smoke rose from burning villages that the Mongols had torched. Bodies lay where they'd fallen. The beaches were chaos as more troops landed and tried to organize for the push inland. And in a small clearing deep in the forest, 40 samurai prepared to throw away their lives for one last chance to hurt the enemy. The moon rose full and bright, which was both a blessing and a curse. It provided enough light to see by, which the samurai needed for their charge. But it also meant the Mongols would see them coming. Sukune decided it didn't matter. Stealth was impossible with 40 horsemen. This would be a direct assault, relying on shock and speed, and the sheer insanity of charging into an army camp of several thousand enemies. At 8 o'clock in the evening, they mounted their horses and began their ride. They didn't take the direct route. Instead, they circled around, approaching from the east, where the Mongols wouldn't expect an attack. As they got within a few hundred meters of the camp, they could hear it. Thousands of men are settling in for the night. Fires crackling, conversations in a dozen languages, laughter from soldiers who thought the battle was won. Sukune gave the signal. 40 samurai spurred their horses to a gallop and erupted from the tree, screaming "Tenno Banzai" at the top of their lungs. The battle cry translates as, May the emperor live 10,000 years. But the emotional content is closer to we die for something greater than ourselves. It was a declaration of loyalty and acceptance of death and a challenge to the enemy, all wrapped into 3 words. The Mongol sentries had perhaps 5 seconds of warning before 40 armored horsemen crashed into the camp. There wasn't enough time. Sentries were cut down before they could sound an alarm. Tents were slashed open, and the soldiers inside were killed before they could grab weapons. Fires were kicked over, spreading flames and creating chaos. For about 3 minutes, it seemed like the samurai might actually cause serious damage. Then the Mongols rallied. Officers began shouting commands. Drums beat emergency signals. Archers formed firing lines and began shooting into the darkness. And one by one, the samurai started to fall. A young samurai was struck by an arrow through his throat while cutting down a Mongol officer. He fell from his horse, gurgling blood, and was immediately set upon by soldiers who finished him with spears. An older samurai had his horse shot out from under him. He landed hard, but got to his feet and kept fighting until a Mongol cavalryman rode him down from behind. Tsukune himself fought like a man possessed. At 67 years old, he should have been slow, but adrenaline and rage are powerful drugs. He cut down Mongol soldiers with his tachi, the long curved sword moving in arcs that separated heads from shoulders. When a Mongol officer tried to rally troops against him, Tsukune killed the officer, then killed the 3 soldiers who'd been standing next to him. But there were just too many of them. Tsukune found himself surrounded by more than 20 Mongol warriors who'd formed a ring around him, stabbing with spears, testing his defenses. He killed 2 more, but his sword blade caught on bone and shattered. Without missing a beat, he drew his tanto, a knife with a blade less than a foot long, and kept fighting. An arrow caught in the chest, punching through his armor and lodging near his heart. He stumbled but didn't fall, taking 1 more step forward, stabbing the tanto into the throat of the nearest enemy. A spear thrust caught him in the side. Still he stood, refusing to fall. A second arrow, this one in his shoulder, a third in his leg, and finally his body could take no more. He collapsed forward on the pile of dead Mongols he created. His last words, witnessed by a Mongol soldier who later recorded the account, were, "Japan will never kneel." The last samurai fell around 10 that evening. Not one had surrendered. Not one had run. They charged into certain death, and taken more than 100 Mongol soldiers with them. And most importantly, they terrified the Mongols in a way that numbers don't convey. These weren't normal soldiers. Normal soldiers run when they're losing. The Japanese just kept fighting until they literally couldn't swing a sword anymore. The Mongol commanders held an emergency council. They'd lost over 1,000 men in a single day to an enemy that should have been swept aside in hours. Morale was shaken. Soldiers were whispering about Japanese demons who couldn't be killed. The decision was made to withdraw to the ships for the night. The official reason was to rest the troops. The real reason, the commanders were afraid of another night attack. So, the Mongol army that had conquered most of Asia retreated to their ships because they were scared of an enemy that was already dead. And this is where the story takes a turn that feels almost like divine intervention. The Korean sailors had been warning about bad weather since they'd arrived. The wind shifted to blow from the north. The seas began to roughen. Korean captains approached the Mongol commanders with a strong recommendation. Leave now, put to sea immediately, and sail back to Korea before the storm traps them. The Mongol generals dismissed these concerns. Koreans were timid. They said, always worrying about the weather. The fleet would be fine. So the fleet stayed, and the Mongol commanders made one more catastrophic decision. To make the ships more stable in the increasing swells, many captains lashed their vessels together in groups. The theory was that larger combined masses would ride out rough seas better. It seemed logical. It was exactly the wrong thing to do. By 10 o'clock in the evening, the wind had reached storm force. Rain began falling in sheets. The fleet anchored in Komoda Bay began to pitch and roll in ways that made soldiers violently seasick. Around midnight, the storm reached its peak intensity. What was hitting Tsushima was a late-season typhoon. Sustained winds were probably in excess of 70 miles per hour. Waves in the open ocean were likely 15 to 20 feet. Ships that were lashed together couldn't maneuver. When one vessel was driven toward the rocks by wind and current, it dragged its neighbors with it. Ropes snapped with sounds like gunshots. Hulls ground against each other, crushing planks and opening seams. Water poured into the holds faster than it could be pumped out. The flat-bottomed barges were the first to go. They rode low in the water by design, and in heavy seas, they simply couldn't stay afloat. Waves broke over their sides, filling them faster than the water could drain. One by one, dozens, and then hundreds of these vessels simply rolled over and sank, taking their crews and the soldiers below decks down with them. Men in armor cannot swim. On the larger warships, crews fought desperately to save their vessels. They cut the lashing ropes, sacrificing the supposed safety of being tied together for the ability to maneuver. They tried to raise anchors and put to sea, but raising a heavy stone anchor in a storm was nearly impossible. Many ships succeeded only in losing their anchors, leaving them adrift. The Korean captains and sailors, who actually knew what they were doing, managed to save some vessels. They cut anchor immediately and tried to ride out the storm in open water away from the deadly coast. But many Korean ships were driven into Amari Bay, where they thought they'd found shelter. Instead, they'd found a trap. The bay became a churning mass of ships, waves, and rocks. Vessels were driven ashore and pounded to pieces. By dawn on November 6th, when the storm finally began to subside, the Mongol invasion fleet had been effectively destroyed. Of the 900 ships that had set out from Korea, between 200 and 300 were completely gone, sunk without a trace. Another 300 to 400 were so badly damaged they'd never sail again. The remaining vessels were intact, but scattered across miles of coastline. The human cost was staggering. Somewhere between 13,000 and 15,000 men had died in the storm, most drowned, pulled under by the weight of their armor, or dashed against rocks by waves. The scene at dawn was apocalyptic. Bodies floated in the water by the hundreds. Wreckage covered the beaches so thickly that you could barely see the sand. Survivors who'd washed ashore were in no condition to fight. Samurai from neighboring islands had been sailing towards Tsushima. They'd expected to find the island conquered. Instead, they found wreckage and scattered, demoralized enemy survivors. The samurai showed no mercy. They hunted down every Mongol soldier they could find and killed them. The only exceptions were made for Chinese conscripts. The Japanese recognized that these men had been forced into service, and many were released. The remaining Mongol ships, those that were still seaworthy, fled back to Korea without even attempting to continue the invasion. They'd lost a third of their entire force in a single night. Kublai Khan's first attempt to conquer Japan had ended in absolute disaster. Word of the storm spread across Japan faster than any messenger could ride, and the timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. The samurai had fought desperately, holding the Mongols at the beaches long enough for night to fall. Then, at the exact moment when all seemed lost, a storm appeared and destroyed the invasion fleet. The Japanese conclusion was obvious. The gods had intervened. Hachiman, the god of war, had sent the storm. And the storm itself, that was kamikaze, the divine wind, heaven's own weapon wielded to protect Japan from foreign invasion. The kamikaze legend became the foundation of Japanese national identity. It established the belief that Japan was fundamentally different from other nations, that it was protected by gods who would never allow foreign conquest. This wasn't just religious belief. It became state policy. For the next 600 years, Japan remained largely isolated from the rest of the world, confident in its divine protection. Kublai Khan, for his part, was furious. This was his first major military defeat, and it stung. For 7 years, he obsessed over Japan. He built a new fleet, even larger than the first. In 1281, he launched a second invasion with 4,400 ships carrying between 70,000 and 140,000 soldiers. It was the largest amphibious assault in human history until D-Day. The invasion followed a similar pattern. Tsushima and Iki fell quickly. But when the Mongol fleet reached Kyushu, they found a massive stone wall around Hakata Bay, 2 meters high and stretching for miles. They couldn't land their troops. For weeks, the fleet sat offshore. Supplies ran low. Disease spread. And then on August 15, 1281, another typhoon struck. This one was even more powerful. For 2 days, Hurricane-force winds battered the fleet. When the storm passed, 80% of the Mongol fleet was destroyed. Over 100,000 men were dead. Kublai Khan never attempted to invade Japan again, and in Japan, the legend of the kamikaze was cemented into national mythology. Twice the Mongols had come. Twice, divine winds had destroyed them. This belief reached its tragic apotheosis in World War II when the Japanese military created the Special Attack Units, suicide pilots who would deliberately crash their planes into Allied ships. They named these pilots kamikaze, hoping to summon divine intervention just as in 1274. Over 4,000 pilots flew suicide missions. But this time there was no storm. The Americans kept coming, and Japan learned the hardest lesson in its history. You cannot base national strategy on mythology. But modern science has actually confirmed that the storms were real. In 2014, geologist John Woodruff published research analyzing sediment cores from Lake Digger on Kyushu. What Woodruff found was remarkable. 2 distinct storm deposits in the late 13th century that corresponded almost exactly to the dates of the Mongol invasions. These deposits consisted of sand layers that could only have gotten into the lake through a major storm surge. The characteristics matched what you'd expect from major typhoons. The scientific explanation involves El Nino patterns. Research has shown that the 13th century had unusually strong El Nino conditions, which increased typhoon activity in the Western Pacific. The storms that saved Japan weren't miracles in the supernatural sense. They were weather patterns that, through climate conditions and sheer luck, happened to occur at the most opportune possible moments. But does the scientific explanation diminish the story? I don't think so. The Mongols still came with overwhelming force. The samurai still fought with suicidal courage. The storm still appeared at the exact moment needed to prevent conquest. Whether you attribute that timing to divine intervention or to random chance, the outcome is the same. Japan remained independent. Let me also address something that bothers me about how this story gets weaponized for nationalist purposes. The kamikaze legend has been used to promote ideas of Japanese uniqueness and superiority. That's dangerous nonsense. Every nation has moments where luck or weather shaped its history. Britain's defeat of the Spanish Armada was aided by storms. Russia's victories over Napoleon and Hitler were helped by winter weather. This doesn't make these nations divinely favored. It makes them lucky. What actually matters is the human element. 80 samurai faced 8,000 enemies knowing they would die and chose to fight anyway. Not because they thought they'd win, not because they expected divine intervention, but because it was the right thing to do. That kind of courage transcends culture and nationalism. You can recognize and respect people who face impossible odds and fight anyway. Now, I want to be honest about the numbers in the title. The historical consensus is 80 mounted samurai at Tsushima, plus about 100 more at Iki Island. So, we're at 180 total. The 50,000 Mongol invaders are also slightly inflated. The actual number was probably 30 to 40,000, but the core truth remains accurate. A vastly outnumbered force of Japanese defenders held off the largest invasion fleet the medieval world had ever seen long enough for a storm to destroy it. And let's talk about the counterfactual. What if the storm hadn't come? What if the Mongols had successfully conquered Tsushima and Iki, established beachheads on Kyushu, and pushed inland? Japan in 1274 was not politically unified. The Mongols were experts at exploiting political divisions. It's entirely plausible that they could have conquered Kyushu, then used it as a base to systematically subjugate the rest of Japan. If that had happened, Japanese culture as we know it might not exist. The samurai class would have been eliminated. Buddhism might have been replaced. The Japanese language could have been displaced. All the cultural achievements that Japan produced over the next 7 centuries might never have occurred. This underscores how contingent history is, how individual moments and decisions ripple forward in ways that reshape everything. If you made it this far, genuinely thank you. Before I wrap up, if you found this valuable, hit that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to telling historical stories that don't fit into the usual narratives. I also want you to comment below with your thoughts. Do you think the samurai made the right choice in fighting? Should they have evacuated? If you were Sukune, what would you have done? These aren't easy questions. And share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. In a world that increasingly feels like it's run by algorithms and spreadsheets, there's something powerful about remembering that sometimes people choose to do the hard thing because it's the right thing. The samurai of Tsushima didn't save Japan by themselves, but they bought enough time for fate and weather to intervene. And sometimes that's all you can do. Hold the line, refuse to quit, and hope the universe decides to help out. The legacy of Tsushima isn't really about divine winds or samurai courage. It's about what happens when ordinary people decide that some things are worth dying for. Home is worth dying for. Family is worth dying for. The idea that you don't surrender to bullies even when they vastly outmatch you, that's worth dying for, too. 750 years later, we still tell their story. The names of most of those 80 samurai are lost to history. We don't know what they looked like or what they feared, but we know they faced the largest invasion fleet in medieval history with nothing but courage and a refusal to quit. And somehow that was enough. Not because they were superhuman, not because the gods favored them, but because sometimes when you make your enemy work for every inch, when you refuse to make it easy for them, circumstances might just shift in your favor. And if they don't, if the storm never comes and you die anyway, well, at least you died standing up. At least you made them remember you. That's not a Japanese value or an American value. That's a human value, and it's one we should never forget. So, here's my challenge to you. The next time you face something that seems impossible, remember Tsushima. Remember the 80 samurai who looked at 8,000 enemies and charged anyway. Your impossible challenge is probably a difficult project, a relationship that needs effort, or a personal goal that seems out of reach. But the principle is the same. Sometimes you fight not because you think you'll win, but because fighting is the right thing to do. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about history. Now go out there and do something that scares you. Hold your line. Refuse to quit. And if you're very lucky, maybe the divine wind will blow your way, too. But don't count on it. Fight as if there are no gods coming to save you, because that's exactly what Tsukune did.